The air at the John Deere dealership hung thick and still, smelling of fresh paint, new tires, and the sweet cloying aroma of money being spent. It was a Saturday morning in the spring of '72, and half the county, it seemed, had turned out to witness the spectacle. Frank Peterson was taking delivery of his new tractor, and it wasn't just any tractor. It was a 7520, the biggest, baddest machine John Deere had ever built. It sat there gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the service bay, a monument of green and yellow steel. Its 8 massive tires, all the same size, made the 4020s parked nearby look like garden tractors. The articulated body, the clean lines, the air-conditioned sound guard cab, it was the future, right there in front of them. Frank stood beside it, chest puffed out, a new Deere cap perched on his head. He was holding court, accepting handshakes and backpats like a proud new father. "She's got the 619 in her," he'd say, loud enough for everyone to hear. 225 horse at the flywheel. "We'll cover some ground this spring, boys, I'll tell you that." Dale Miller slipped in through the side door, trying to be inconspicuous. He held a small, greasy box containing a hydraulic filter. He just needed to pay for his part and get back to his own farm, back to his own machine. But it was impossible not to get drawn into the orbit of Frank's new iron. Dale watched from the back of the small crowd, his face a mask of quiet observation. He understood the appeal. The power, the comfort, the sheer capability of a machine like that was undeniable. It promised efficiency, a way to beat the weather and the clock. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Frank's voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs of admiration. He'd spotted Dale. Every head turned. "Come on up, Dale. Get a look at a real tractor." Dale felt a familiar heat rise in his neck, but he kept his expression neutral. He gave a short nod. "Looks like a nice machine, Frank." "Nice machine?" Frank laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Dale, this thing will do more work in a day than that homemade junk pile of yours does in a week. When are you going to get serious and trade in that old Steiger? I hear the scrapyard is paying top dollar for rusty iron." A few of the men chuckled. Dale knew his tractor was the butt of many jokes at the coffee shop. It was a Series 1 Steiger Super Wildcat, built back in '68 in a barn up in Minnesota, before the Steiger brothers even had a proper factory. It was raw and agricultural, all sharp angles and exposed steel. The green paint was faded to a chalky mint, and rust bloomed along the weld seams. It didn't have a sleek, quiet cab, just a simple roll cage and a canvas top for summer. But inside that long, square hood was its heart, a big yellow Caterpillar 3306 diesel engine that Dale had shoehorned in himself after the original Cummins had given up the ghost. Dale just shrugged. "She's paid for, Frank. Runs good enough for me." "Paid for don't get the crop in the ground," Frank shot back, turning to his audience again. "You got to spend money to make money. That's the name of the game now. You can't get ahead sitting on your hands, afraid to take a chance." He patted the huge rear tire of the 7520. "This right here, this is an investment in the future. The bank understands that." Dale knew all about the bank. He could see the lean, hungry look in the eyes of Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, who stood beaming beside Frank. He saw the thick sheaf of papers Frank had just signed. Dale knew that tractor didn't really belong to Frank. It belonged to the Farmers National Bank, and Frank was just making the payments. He paid for his filter at the counter, the $50 bill feeling heavy in his hand. As he walked out, the last thing he heard was Frank's voice. "Yeah, poor old Dale." His dad filled his head with all that Depression-era nonsense about debt. He'll be small-time his whole life. The drive back to his own farm was a quiet one. Frank's words echoed in the cab of his old Ford F-250. Was he a fool? Every farmer in the county was expanding, leveraging up, buying the newest and the best. And here he was, nursing along a machine that was already considered an antique. He pulled into his yard. It was neat and tidy, but there was no denying its age. The barn his grandfather had built still stood straight and true. Its red paint faded but sound. The machine shed was smaller than the new pole barns popping up all over, but every tool inside had its place. And there, sitting behind the shed, was the Steiger. To Dale it wasn't a junk pile. It was a testament to simple, brutal strength. He walked over and laid a hand on the massive fender, the steel cool under his palm. He knew every bolt, every weld, every grease zerk on that machine. He'd had the engine out twice, rebuilt the transmission himself, and replaced more hydraulic hoses than he could count. The planetary axles were from an old military surplus earth mover. The steering was a bit sloppy, and it leaked a little oil from just about everywhere. But when that cat engine fired up, its deep, throaty roar was the sound of pure, unadulterated power. It would pull anything he hitched to it and ask for more. And most importantly, when he shut it off at night and went inside for supper, he knew that it was his. 100%. His father's voice was as clear in his mind as it was the day he died. "The bank man ain't your friend, son," he'd said, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of work. "He's a fella who'll lend you an umbrella when the sun is shining, and ask for it back the second it starts to rain. Own what you own, and owe no man nothing. That's the only real freedom a man has." Dale opened the small box from the dealership and looked at the new filter. It was a simple part for a complex machine. He knew the work that lay ahead, the constant maintenance, the inevitable breakdowns. He looked across the section line, toward Frank Peterson's place. He couldn't see the new 7520 yet, but he knew it would be there soon, a green speck moving across the black earth with terrifying speed. He felt a pang of something, not envy exactly, but a weariness, a feeling of being left behind. Now, before we get into the thick of it, I gotta ask you all something. Have you ever known a fella like Dale who stuck to his guns with old iron while everyone else was chasing the new and shiny? Let me know down in the comments what kind of machine he was running. A lot of good iron out there that people forgot about. That spring was a wet one. The rain came down in cold, relentless sheets, turning the rich black soil of Iowa into a thick, greasy gumbo. The planting window, that critical time to get the corn in the ground, was shrinking with every grey, miserable day. It was the kind of spring that tested a man's patience and his equipment. On the first half-decent day, Frank Peterson was out in force. The sight of that new John Deere 7520 was something to behold. It moved across his fields with an authority that was almost arrogant. The jewels on all four corners gave it a massive footprint, allowing it to float over the damp ground where a two-wheel drive tractor would have sunk to its axles. Behind it, he pulled a brand new 24-foot disc and a 12-row planter, a combination that devoured acres at an astonishing rate. The talk at the co-op was all about Frank. "Saw Peterson out this morning," one farmer would say, nursing a cup of coffee. "He'll be done planting by the weekend at this rate." "That new Deere is worth every penny in a year like this," another would add. "Power and flotation, that's the ticket." Dale heard it all. He was out too, but his progress was slower, more deliberate. His old Steiger, with its big single tires, had to be handled with more care. He couldn't pull as wide an implement, and he had to pick his way through the wet spots. Still, the Caterpillar engine lugged down and did the work, its exhaust stack puffing out black smoke as the big chisel plow bit deep into the soil. He was making headway, turning the wet topsoil up to the wind to dry. He was working a piece of ground on the north end of his farm, right along the road, when it happened. He was in the middle of a long pull, the engine settled into a deep, rhythmic growl. The ground was heavy, and the tractor was working hard. Then came the sound. It wasn't a grind or a squeal. It was a sharp, percussive crack, like a rifle shot right under his seat, followed instantly by a sickening lurch and the high-pitched scream of shearing metal. The tractor's left side dropped violently, and the whole machine skewed sideways, digging a deep furrow in the mud before shuddering to a dead stop. Dale's heart hammered against his ribs. He immediately shut down the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of hot metal and the drip of hydraulic fluid. He knew, with the cold certainty of a man who knows his machine intimately, that this was not a simple fix. This was catastrophic. He climbed down, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The problem was obvious. The outer planetary hub on the left rear axle was canted at a grotesque angle. A dark, thick river of 90-weight gear oil was pouring out of a crack in the housing, soaking into the black soil. Something inside, a sun gear or a planet gear, had completely shattered, taking the rest of the assembly with it. The tractor was dead in the water, a three-legged beast, miles from the workshop. It took him the rest of the day just to get it home. He had to use his old Farmall M and a long chain to drag the crippled giant, one painful lurching foot at a time, back down the lane to the machine shed. Every clank and groan of the broken axle was a fresh twist of the knife. The next morning, the full scope of the disaster became clear. He got the massive wheel off and began the greasy, back-breaking work of tearing down the planetary drive. The housing was ruined, and when he finally got it open, a pile of metal shards, once hardened and precise gears, fell onto the concrete floor. Finding parts for a 1968 Steiger with military surplus axles was not a matter of calling the local dealer. It was a matter of detective work and sheer luck. He spent 2 days on the phone, calling every tractor salvage yard in a 500-mile radius. Most had never even heard of the axle model number. The replies became a familiar, frustrating chorus. "Nope, can't help you there. Haven't seen one of those in 20 years. You might as well scrap that old thing, son." All the while, the clock was ticking. The sun was out now, and the fields were drying fast. From his shop, he could see Frank's 7520, a distant green machine, methodically striping the landscape, finishing up his last fields. The sight filled Dale with a cold, desperate anger. Finally, a grizzled old voice on the other end of a crackling line from a salvage yard in western Nebraska gave him a glimmer of hope. "Yeah, I might have something like that, off an old army scraper. It's been sitting out in the back 40 for a decade. Can't promise what shape it's in." Dale didn't hesitate. He hooked up his gooseneck trailer to the F-250, threw a greasy canvas and a set of tools in the back, and started driving west. The 8-hour trip was a blur of flat highways and mounting anxiety. The salvage yard was a graveyard of forgotten iron, acres of rusting machines slowly surrendering to the prairie grass. The old man led him to the axle, and Dale's heart sank. It was a tangled, rusty mess, half buried in the dirt. But it was the right one. He spent the rest of the day wrestling the planetary hub off the donor axle, his knuckles bleeding, his muscles screaming in protest. He haggled with the old man, finally settling on a price that felt like extortion, but was his only option. The drive home, through the night, was fueled by lukewarm coffee and grim determination. The next 2 days were a marathon of cleaning, rebuilding, and reassembly. He worked under the harsh glare of a single trouble light, the smell of gear oil and solvent thick in the air. He had to fabricate a new gasket by hand, carefully tapping it out from a sheet of cork. He meticulously cleaned and inspected every bearing, packing them with fresh grease. He used a hydraulic press and a torch to fit the new components together, his movements precise and practiced. During one of his short breaks, as he sat on an overturned bucket drinking water, a new pickup truck slowed on the road, a cloud of dust billowing behind it. It was Frank Peterson. He didn't stop, but he slowed enough for Dale to see the look on his face. It was a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. Frank shook his head slowly, a small smirk playing on his lips, and then accelerated away. The mockery didn't need to be spoken. Dale could hear it in the silence. "See, that's what he gets for running that homemade junk. Should have traded it in years ago." He could feel the judgment of the entire community bearing down on him. He was the fool on the hill, the stubborn throwback who refused to see the future. The feeling didn't break him. It forged his resolve into something as hard as the steel he was working with. Finally, late on the third night, it was done. He filled the axle with fresh oil, bolted the massive tire back on, and lowered the tractor off the jacks. He climbed into the seat, his body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. He turned the key. The big Cat diesel sputtered to life, settling into its familiar, powerful rumble. He put it in gear, let out the clutch, and the Steiger moved forward, solid and true. He had lost a week of prime planting time, but he hadn't been beaten. The years that followed were a blur of hard work and changing fortunes. The mid-1970s arrived, and with them came a wave of prosperity, the likes of which no one had ever seen. The massive grain sales to the Soviet Union sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been $1.50 a bushel, suddenly shot past $3. Soybeans were even crazier, climbing to $6, $7, even $10. For the American farmer, it was like a gold rush. The money was flowing like water. Nowhere was this new prosperity more evident than at Frank Peterson's farm. He became the undisputed king of the county. The high grain prices meant his land was suddenly worth a fortune, and he used that inflated equity as collateral for a breathtaking expansion. He bought the 320 acres to his east, then another 160 to the south. His farm swelled to over 1,000 acres. The 2-year-old John Deere 7520 was deemed too small, too slow. He traded it in for a brand new, top-of-the-line Versatile 875, an absolute monster of a tractor with over 300 horsepower. He didn't stop there. He bought a new Gleaner N6 combine with an 8-row corn head and a 20-foot bean platform. A fleet of new grain trucks sat gleaming in his yard next to a newly constructed machine shed that was bigger than Dale's barn and house combined. A set of massive silver grain bins rose up like cathedrals, a monument to his success, all of it financed by the Farmers National Bank. Frank was the very picture of the modern, successful farmer, and Mr. Abernathy at the bank treated him like royalty. Dale, too, was making more money than he ever had. His yields were excellent, his bins were full, and the checks from the elevator were bigger than he'd ever dreamed. But his response to the boom was starkly different from Frank's. The windfall didn't change his habits, it reinforced them. He remembered his father's other piece of advice: "Good times don't last, son. When it's raining gold, put out a bucket, not a thimble. But don't forget to build a good roof for the storm that's sure to follow." So Dale put out his bucket. But he didn't spend the money on new iron. He took a portion of the profits and paid a crew in cash to put a new steel roof on the big old barn, ensuring it would stand for another 50 years. He finally retired the aging Farmall M and bought a used but immaculate International 1066. It was a strong, simple tractor he could rely on for lighter chores, and he paid for it with a single check. The rest of the money, the vast majority of it, he put away. He didn't trust the stock market. Instead, he bought certificates of deposit at the bank, locking in the high interest rates of the inflationary 70s. He was saving, building a fortress of cash, brick by brick. To his neighbors, his behavior was baffling, almost perverse. They saw his old Steiger, now looking even more weathered, next to the brand new machines popping up all over the county. They saw his modest farmstead, his refusal to buy more land when it was available. They mistook his prudence for fear, his discipline for a lack of ambition. "Can you believe Dale Miller," they'd say down at the cafe, "sitting on a pile of cash and still farming with that old junk? He could be the biggest operator in the county if he wanted to be. Frank says he's just scared of his own shadow." The scorn was palpable. He was no longer just an eccentric. He was seen as a failure, a man who lacked the vision and the nerve to seize the moment. Frank, in particular, seemed to take Dale's quiet thrift as a personal insult. "Some guys just don't have the stomach for the big leagues," Frank would say, loud enough for Dale to hear at the elevator. "They're content to play in the minor leagues their whole life." One afternoon, Dale was at the bank rolling over one of his CDs. Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, called him into his office. The man was all smiles and smooth talk, his desk covered in loan applications from other farmers. "Dale, my boy, it's good to see you," Abernathy began, leaning back in his leather chair. "I see you're saving your money. That's admirable, truly. But you're missing the boat. The Henderson place, 240 acres right next to your North Quarter, is coming up for sale. With your financial position, we could have the papers drawn up this afternoon. Land prices are only going one way, Dale. Up. It's a guaranteed investment. You're sitting on a gold mine, but you're not digging." Dale listened politely, then shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Abernathy, but I'm happy with what I've got. I can handle what I own by myself, and I sleep well at night." Abernathy's smile tightened. He saw Dale not as a valued customer, but as a wasted opportunity. "Suit yourself, Dale, but opportunity doesn't knock forever." As Dale left the office, his eyes fell on a chart pinned to the bulletin board in the lobby. It was a simple line graph titled Prime Interest Rate. For years, the line had been relatively flat, but recently it had started to climb, slowly at first, then more steeply. It was at 8%, then 9%, then 10%. Another small newspaper clipping was tacked next to it, the headline talking about an oil embargo and a fellow named the Shah of Iran. Most people ignored it, caught up in the euphoria of $3 corn, but Dale felt a prickle of unease, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. It was the same feeling a man gets when the sky turns a strange greenish color and the air goes unnaturally still. He walked out of the bank and looked across the town square toward the distant fields. The party was in full swing, the music was loud, and everyone was dancing. But Dale could hear a different sound, a faint, far-off rumble, like the sound of a coming storm. The rumble Dale had heard on the horizon arrived not as thunder, but as silence. It began in the summer of 1980. The sky, which should have been a hazy, humid blue, turned a hard, metallic grey. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a relentless sun beat down, baking the rich Iowa soil into a cracked, pale concrete. The corn, which had stood so proud and green in June, began to curl its leaves inward, a desperate, thirsty prayer. By mid-July, the lower leaves were firing, turning a sickly yellow-brown. The tassels emerged weak and scattered, shedding their precious pollen onto silks that had already dried up and died. For farmers like Frank Peterson, leveraged to the hilt, the drought was a catastrophe. His massive fields, which required massive inputs of fertilizer and fuel, were turning into a massive liability. His cash flow, a mighty river just a few years before, had slowed to a trickle. He needed a bumper crop just to make his payments. What he was getting was a disaster. One blistering afternoon in early August, Dale was cultivating a field of soybeans, trying to conserve what little moisture was left in the ground. His old Steiger chugged along, the big cat engine barely working. He saw a cloud of dust on the road and watched as the John Deere dealer's service truck turned into Frank's lane. A few hours later, it left. The next day, it was back. Dale learned the story at the co-op. Frank's mighty versatile 875, the pride of the county, was down. It wasn't a simple mechanical failure that a farmer could fix with a wrench and some ingenuity. The sophisticated Allison automatic transmission had developed a fault in its hydraulic control valve body, a labyrinth of precision-machined passages and delicate springs. The tractor would shift erratically or not at all, leaving it useless. The dealership mechanic, a young man trained on computer diagnostics, was stumped. They had to fly a specialist in from the Versatile factory in Winnipeg. The cost of the service call alone was more than Dale's property taxes for the year. The parts, when they finally arrived, were on backorder for 2 weeks. For 2 critical weeks, as the weeds took hold in his suffering fields, Frank's 300-horsepower giant sat idle, a monument to paralyzed modernity. He eventually had to hire a neighbor to finish his cultivating, paying a custom rate that made him physically ill. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Frank Peterson for a decade had begun to crack. For the first time, people saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. But the real blow came not from the sky or from a broken transmission, but from the mail. The letters began arriving from the Farmers National Bank. They were crisp, formal notices, a far cry from the friendly backslapping Mr. Abernathy had once offered. The prime interest rate, which had been climbing steadily, had gone parabolic. Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, was on a crusade to kill inflation. And his weapon of choice was brutal, punishing interest. The prime rate hit 15%, then 18%, then an unthinkable 21%. Frank's operating loans, the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had borrowed for seed, fuel, and fertilizer, were all on variable rates. His payments didn't just double, they tripled, then quadrupled. It was like trying to run up a down escalator that was speeding up with every step. The money he had made in the 70s, which he had poured into land and iron, was gone. The equity in his land, which the bank had told him would only go up, began to evaporate as the crisis deepened and land values plummeted. The foundation of his empire, built on the shifting sands of debt and cheap credit, was crumbling. Dale, meanwhile, was battening down the hatches. The drought hit him too. His yields were cut in half. But the pain was different. It was a flesh wound, not a mortal one. He had no massive payments to make. His fuel bill was his biggest expense, and he cut back wherever he could, parking his pickup and using the old Farmall for chores around the yard. The money he had saved, those CDs he had diligently purchased, were now his salvation. While Frank was paying 21% interest to the bank was paying Dale 17% on his certificates. The interest checks that arrived each month were a lifeline, enough to pay the bills and keep food on the table. His father's words about the coming storm had been prophetic. Dale had built his roof, and now the hurricane was making landfall. He kept his head down and his tractor running, a quiet survivor in a sea of financial ruin. The fall of 1982 was cold and grey, a fitting backdrop for the despair that had settled over the countryside. The harvest was a grim affair. Yields were abysmal, and to add insult to injury, the grain prices had collapsed. The bottom had fallen out of the market. The gold rush was officially over. All that was left were the hangovers and the crushing weight of debt. All over the county, the signs of the crisis were impossible to ignore. Brand new combines sat in sheds, their owners unable to afford the fuel to run them. Fields lay fallow, choked with weeds. And the most heartbreaking sign of all, the auction bills, tacked to telephone poles, and the bulletin board at the co-op. Their stark black lettering announcing the end of a family's dream. The names were a roll call of the ambitious, the ones who had followed Frank Peterson's lead and bet the farm on the promise of endless growth. Frank's own downfall was the most spectacular of all. He had fought it for as long as he could, selling off grain reserves, deferring payments, pleading with the bank. But Mr. Abernathy was no longer a friend or a partner in progress. He was a man with a board of directors to answer to, a man whose own job was on the line. The bank's generosity had vanished, replaced by the cold, hard calculus of asset liquidation. The foreclosure notice was served on a Tuesday morning. The auction was set for a Saturday in early November. The sky was the color of lead, and a bitter wind whipped across the barren fields, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees in Frank's yard. It felt like the whole county had turned out, not in celebration, but as witnesses to a public execution. They stood in huddled groups, their faces grim, their hands shoved deep in their pockets. These were the same men who had once stood in the dealership, clapping Frank on the back. Now they shuffled their feet and avoided his gaze. Frank's life was laid bare for all to see, every piece of it tagged with a number. The mighty versatile tractor, the Gleaner combine, the fleet of trucks, they were all lined up in a neat funereal row. His tools, his livestock equipment, even his wife's canning jars from the cellar were set out on hay racks, their value reduced to whatever a stranger was willing to pay. Frank and his wife stood on the porch of the farmhouse they were about to lose, looking like ghosts at their own wake. Frank's face was hollowed out, the cocksure swagger replaced by a stooped, defeated slump. He had aged 10 years in the last 6 months. Dale arrived late and stood at the back of the crowd, his old canvas work coat pulled tight against the wind. He wasn't there to gloat or to pick over the bones. He felt a profound, aching sadness. He saw in Frank not an enemy, but a man who had simply believed the gospel of his time, a gospel of easy credit and endless expansion. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a booming voice, started with the smaller items. Then he moved to the machinery. The bidding was sluggish. No one had any money. The prices were shockingly low, a fraction of what Frank had paid. A four-wheel drive tractor that had cost over $100,000 just a few years earlier sold for $25,000. It was a bloodbath. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the last and most important item on the bill. All right, folks, now for the moment we're all here for. We are selling absolute to the highest bidder, the home quarter. 160 acres more or less, with house, barn and all outbuildings. A finer farmstead you will not find in this county. What'll you give? Who will start me at $1,000 an acre? A dead silence fell over the crowd. $1,000 an acre was a fortune now. A few years ago, it would have been a steal. The auctioneer tried again, his voice straining. Folks, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Do I hear 1,000? 900? 800? More silence. Mr. Abernathy stood near the front, his arms crossed, a grim look on his face. If the land didn't bring a high enough price, the bank would still hold a massive deficiency judgment against Frank, a debt that would follow him for the rest of his life. Just as the auctioneer was about to pass on the property, a quiet voice came from the back of the crowd. 600. Every head turned. It was Dale Miller. A murmur went through the crowd. Dale? Dale, who had never borrowed a dime, who was still running that old homemade tractor. Abernathy's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in calculation. Another bidder, a well-known land speculator from a neighboring county, called out, 625. $6.50, Dale said, his voice calm and steady. $6.75, the speculator shot back, a predatory gleam in his eye. The two went back and forth, the price climbing in $25 increments. The crowd was mesmerized. This wasn't just about land anymore, it was a battle of two philosophies. Finally, the speculator reached his limit. He shook his head and stepped back. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the cold air, "for $750 an acre, to Mr. Dale Miller." A collective sigh went through the crowd. Dale didn't smile. He walked forward through the parting sea of people, his face unreadable. He approached the clerk's table where Mr. Abernathy was standing. "I'll be paying in cash, Mr. Abernathy," Dale said quietly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "A cashier's check from your bank, as a matter of fact. The full amount." Abernathy was speechless. The man he had once dismissed as a timid fool, the man who was sitting on a gold mine but not digging, had just bought the crown jewel of his star customer's failed empire with the very money Abernathy had urged him to risk. The irony was as thick and cold as the November air. Dale didn't stop there. He walked over to the porch where Frank was standing, his wife sobbing quietly beside him. Frank looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and disbelief. He expected a lecture, a final bitter "I told you so." Instead, Dale held out his hand. "Frank," he said, his voice gentle, "I'm not a landlord. I'm a farmer. I need someone to help me work this new ground. And I can't think of a better man than you. The house is yours to live in, for as long as you want. We can work out a fair rent, maybe a crop share agreement. We'll make it work." Frank stared at Dale's outstretched hand, then at his face. He saw no pity, no smug satisfaction. He saw only decency. The dam of his pride, the last thing he had left, finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He swallowed hard and took Dale's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you, Dale," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you." The years that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the landscape and on the souls of the people who worked it. Many families had been lost, their names vanishing from the mailboxes at the end of long gravel lanes. But the community, in its own quiet way, endured. Dale's reputation was transformed. The whispers at the cafe were no longer of mockery, but of a deep and abiding respect. He was no longer Dale the throwback, but Dale the survivor, the man who had seen the storm coming and had built his ark. He never expanded aggressively, but he did buy a few more farms as they came up for sale, always from families in distress, always paying a fair price in cash and often offering to lease the ground back to the very people who had sold it. His farm grew, not like a wildfire, but like a sturdy oak, its roots sunk deep in the black soil, its growth slow, deliberate and strong. He was building not an empire of debt, but a legacy of stewardship. Frank Peterson became Dale's right-hand man. The arrangement was hard on his pride at first, but with time, the bitterness faded, replaced by a quiet gratitude. He was a good farmer, and freed from the crushing weight of debt and the pressure to expand, he rediscovered his love for the work itself, the smell of turned earth, the satisfaction of a straight corn row. The two men, once rivals, forged an unlikely friendship born of shared hardship and mutual respect. They would often work late into the evening, fixing machinery in Dale's shop. One night they were working on the old Steiger. It was still Dale's main tillage tractor, its faded green paint now bearing the honourable scars of 20 seasons. They were replacing a wheel bearing, the massive hub sitting on blocks on the concrete floor. "You know, Dale," Frank said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, "I used to laugh at this old tractor, called it a junk pile." He shook his head. "I was a fool. I had the newest, the biggest, the best of everything. But when it broke, I had to call a man in a clean uniform who charged me $100 an hour just to look at it. You know every bolt on this thing. When it breaks, you fix it. You don't owe anyone for it. It serves you. I was a slave to my machines." Dale just nodded, tightening a nut with a long wrench. "My father used to say that the best tractor is a paid-for tractor." Years melted into decades. The 1980s gave way to the 90s and the new millennium. Dale's hair turned from brown to grey, his hands becoming as gnarled and calloused as his father's had been. He never bought a brand new tractor. He found he had a knack for buying well-maintained older machines at auctions, machines from the era when steel was thick and electronics was scarce. His farm was a working museum of the most reliable iron ever built. One warm spring afternoon, Dale was out in the machine shed watching his grandson, a boy of 16 with his grandfather's quiet eyes, carefully greasing the zerks on the old Steiger. The boy moved with a familiar competence, his movements sure and practiced. "Grandpa," the boy said, looking up from his work, "some of the kids at school, their dads are buying these new tractors, the ones that steer themselves with satellites. They say we're falling behind with all this old stuff." Dale walked over and placed a hand on the tractor's massive fender, the steel warm from the afternoon sun. He looked at his grandson, and in that moment he saw the long, unbroken line stretching back to his own father and his father before him. "Let me tell you something," Dale said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, much like the engine of the tractor itself. "There's nothing wrong with new machines, as long as you're the one who owns them, and they're not the ones who own you. This tractor, this land, they don't look fancy, but they're ours. We don't owe a single dollar to any man in a suit and tie. That means when the wind blows hard, and it always does, sooner or later, we don't break. We just bend a little, and we wait for the sun to come out again. That's not being behind, son. That's being free." The boy looked at the old tractor, then at his grandfather's weathered face, and he understood. He picked up the grease gun again, a look of quiet determination settling over him. Dale watched him for a moment longer, a deep sense of peace washing over him. The seeds his father had planted so long ago, seeds of wisdom and prudence, had taken root. The harvest, he knew, would be safe for another generation.